Certainly, sort of the geopolitical impact, obviously, but it's very Hong Kong specific, and obviously, although the rest of the region is down somewhat, the Hong Kong market is feeling the brunt of that. That relates obviously to those protests and the possibility of increased activity by students at this stage. So I think at this stage, it's something to be watching very closely. But clearly, we've got every nation in the region is dealing with its own issues around COVID-19 and coming out of that isolation.
At the NPC, no GDP target for the first time that we've seen, but you're more concerned about, of course, the souring relations between China and the United States and China and Australia going forward, right?
Well, certainly in the mix in regards to some of those concerns, clearly there's been some concessions by China in regards to an independent review of the causes of and impacts of COVID-19, and that's clearly good news. But certainly for Australia in regards to on the trade side, that has to be viewed as a concern. But we have seen these issues rise in the past, and they have been mutually resolved reasonably well over time. But unfortunately, it hasn't come at a great time, particularly in regards to the Australian economy. But I think in terms of touching on the NPC not putting in place a GDP forecast, we have got some sense of how the economy is going from the numbers that were released earlier on for the April data. And obviously we've seen a modest improvement in things like industrial production. We certainly do see that supply side is outpacing demand at this stage, but you are getting some growth impact. And it's most likely that we think that GDP could turn into a positive number, around 2% growth for the second quarter, given those industrial production numbers as well. But of course, things are very fluid for every economy, and to some extent it's understandable the NPC has decided not to endorse a particular range by which they're forecasting GDP growth.
Do you think that these rising tensions could be the thorn in the side of any global recovery that we're likely to see later on this year?
I doubt it has that sort of impact, Matt. I mean, clearly it's in the mix, but I don't think that, once again, each individual country is working very, very hard in regards to its own domestic issues, in particular around going through a de-isolating process. And I think that's probably front of mind for most governments, and in particular, obviously, for most people in countries. So they won't be ignoring what's going on in Hong Kong at this stage in terms of the protests. But I think there's also some pretty significant issues for each individual country and economy to get over.
You're still expecting a V-shaped recovery. How do you then trade markets across the Asia-Pacific with that in mind?
Yeah, the V-shaped recovery is a view we've held for quite some time. Obviously, we're not expecting to see economic growth return to pre-COVID levels for a couple of years, but we do think there's a high level of pent-up demand that will surge into the second and third quarters of this year. And with the combination of economies starting to open up, that will probably drive very negative figures into modestly positive numbers going into that. It's really more a 2021 story. It's possible, and potentially in the case of China, it might be a W-shaped recovery, particularly, as I mentioned before, that we are seeing supply side outpacing demand quite significantly for the Chinese economy at this stage. But broadly speaking, for developed world economies, we do think there will be likely a V-shaped rebound, and to some extent it's driven and supported by clearly various stimulatory packages by governments and obviously central banks truly doing their bit. I think in comparison to the GFC, we've seen that basically the fiscal packages put out are basically almost twice the size of those packages put in place for the GFC. And from a central bank perspective, both in terms of cutting rates and their securities buying programs, it's almost 3 times the size of GFC. So quite clearly significant stimulatory support across the world. And that, to some extent, gives us some buffer in terms of a V-shaped recovery view.